Go. Okay, ontological argument. Now, ontological argument is unique because it is our only a priori argument. Now, those of you watching this back on video should have mentioned that as well for both Aristotle and for Plato. Plato is a priori, isn't he, because he believes in innate knowledge. Aristotle is a posteriori because he believes in knowledge through experience. So this is our only a priori argument. And the ontological argument literally means concerned with being. Because at its heart is the definition, hence the being bit. So we start with the definition, and the idea is, because it's a priori, using logic and reason, we can say with definite that there is proof that God exists. Now, the other a posteriori arguments might be strong arguments, but none of them could actually say with certainty that God exists. The only way that we can, with certainty, say anything is through a priori logic. And that is key to any evaluation questions which you're going to do. The strength of this lies in the fact that it's dealing with logic. So we can say with absolute certainty that 2 plus 2 equals 4, can't we? So that's the only way we ever know things with absolute certainty, through logic and reason. Now, we've got two versions of the argument. We've got St. Anselm, and we've got Descartes, and then we've got two criticisms. And Anselm is specifically criticised by Gournilot and Mortimer, and Descartes is criticised by Kant. Now, Gournilot criticises Anselm, Kant criticises Descartes, but you can use either of them for each essay. As long as you don't say Kant specifically criticised Anselm, and you should never say Gournilot criticised Descartes, because Gournilot was well dead and buried when Descartes comes on the scene. But you can obviously use the same arguments. You could say we could use it to criticise them rather than saying that they criticised them. So, dealing with Anselm first. Anselm's definition, and which nothing greater can be conceived. And we split up Anselm's argument into two ways, his first and then his second. And his first stage, what he's ultimately saying is that if we understand that, we have to conclude God exists. And if we do not conclude God exists and we do understand it, we are a fool not to, aren't we? And the reason that we're a fool is because if God only exists in the mind, then anything that actually exists is greater. So, for instance, you are all greater because you can push a chair over. So what he says, if we accept that definition, he said we do accept that definition, then in order for the definition to make sense, in order for it to be coherent, then God must exist. It's as simple as that. Now, his second version, the second part of it, is the idea of necessary existence. And this is all on the basis of contingency and non-contingency. God is unique because his nature is a non-contingent being. Therefore, that is why it is applicable to use the ontological argument. Because it concludes that we must have one thing which is non-contingent. So, in order to have a contingent existence, a non-contingent being is necessary. Which is very similar, isn't it, to Aquinas' third way of the cosmological argument.
How does that you all the push a chair thing relate to it? Sorry.
If God only exists in the mind, then he couldn't push the chair over. You can all push a chair over, you're not omnipotent, you're not all-powerful, but you're greater than God if God doesn't exist. A God who exists only in the mind can never be referred to as the greatest. And that is our definition. Our definition is the greatest being imaginable. Gournilot criticises Anselm, and he does it in his book On Behalf of the Fool, which is significant because obviously Anselm said that you're a fool if you don't accept this, if you understand it. Gordon though says, I don't understand it, but I don't accept it, so I'm going to write on behalf of all the fools. Anselm writes in the Proslogion. The Age of the Cave comes in the Republic. Aristotle writes in, I think the four causes come in Nicomachean Ethics, which is named after his son, who's called Nicomachean.
What's it called?
Nicomachean or Nicomachean Ethics. Nicomachean. Gordon Lowe, on behalf of the fool, says this: you're simply defining something into existence. And he says that this is absurd. It's ridiculous. You can't define something into existence. And he says, all you're doing, I can do it. And he gives the example of a perfect island. He says, if we can conceive of a perfect island, then any real island would be better. Therefore, our imaginary perfect island must exist. And he says, and obviously it doesn't exist. Now, we can use Anselm's second argument to counter Gordon Lowe's by saying, look, this is different because God's non-contingent. And to be a little bit more specific, he says an island is contingent, and there's absolutely nothing in the definition of an island that says that it must be perfect, whereas it is the definition of God that he's the greatest. Definition of island is an expansive land surrounded by water, not that it's perfect. Now, Descartes. It's exactly the same argument, but a different definition. Here, we've got a supremely perfect being that contains all perfections. And ultimately what Descartes says is, still using logic and reason, he says that one of these perfections is existence. Because he says, how can we improve on imaginary? Your imaginary girlfriend, your imaginary dessert from when we were in lessons. How do you improve on that? If it was real. So, in order for God to be supremely perfect, he must exist. And the example he uses is of the triangle. And what he says is a triangle is a three-sided object, or a three-angled object. And what he says is that using logic and reason, we can predicate. So when we have a subject, when we have a definition, we can predicate things. And what we can predicate from that is that the angles add up to 180 degrees. So when we have God, and we have the perfect being, one of the predicates is omnipotence, benevolence, omniscience. And one of them is existence. Because if we were going to say doesn't exist, that is what we call a logical contradiction. Can we have a triangle with 170 degrees? With 190 degrees? No, it's illogical. It cannot happen. We know that with certainty. And Descartes says we can therefore know with certainty that God must exist. And to criticise him, we have Kant. And Kant said two things. The first thing he said is that there is no contradiction when you remove the subject from the predicate. So, you only have to have 180 degrees if you have the triangle. If you've got the square, you don't have 180 degrees. Therefore, you only have to have God exists if you have God. So, it is entirely logical for someone who believes in God to believe he exists. It's entirely illogical for someone to believe in God and not believe he exists. But it is not illogical for someone who does not believe in God, therefore doesn't have the subject matter, to have the predicate. We only have 2 plus 2 equals 4 if we've got either the 2, the plus, or the 2. We take one of them out, it's no longer a problem. And his second stage is about predicate. And he says, is the predicate adding anything? Is existence a predicate? And he challenges that it's not. And we use the example which Russell used about unicorns and cows. So, cows exist, unicorns do not exist. And what both Kant and Russell would say is that that tells us nothing about the nature of the being. A cow, a unicorn, Whether one is real, whether one is not real, doesn't matter. A cow is still what it is, and a unicorn is still what it is. And that's the ontological argument. Questions?
Can you go over Kant again, please?
Yeah.
I missed all that.
2 stages. Kant says that Descartes would say it would be a contradiction to say God does not exist. And he says, you're right. In the same way, it's a contradiction to say 2 plus 2 equals 5. That's a contradiction. But it's not a contradiction if you remove the subject matter. So in the 2 plus 2 analogy, if you take out a 2 and just says something plus 2 equals 5, that's not a contradiction. It is not a contradiction to say God does not exist if you do not have God. So if you believe God is a supremely perfect being, then you must believe he exists, because obviously one of those perfections would be existence. But if you don't, then it's no longer a contradiction. You don't have to do it if you remove it. You only have 180 degrees if you have the triangle. If you've got a different shape, you're going to have a different answer. And the second, about the predicate, a predicate is something that adds to our understanding, adds to the nature. And he argues that it doesn't actually add anything. Existence. And it's cow's unicorn example. If I asked you to draw a picture of a unicorn, you could all draw a picture of a unicorn.
Even though it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah. If I asked you to draw a picture of a cow, you could all draw a picture of a cow. The fact that one exists and one doesn't exist does not change the nature. Well, that's quite easy to criticise as well, because some people would argue it does.
With Gordon's criticism, you know, when he says, talks about the perfect balance, he says something about intrinsic maximum.
Okay. So, when Gordon's talking about that, when in terms of the intrinsic maximum, what he says is that there must be built in with it the best of something. So there must then exist, when we have any object, the best chair, the best tree. And he says, because I can conceive of that, you know, using that argument means it must exist. But that's what Anselm criticised, the idea of the different natures, that there doesn't need to be an intrinsic maxim. There isn't the best tree, there isn't the perfect island. Okay? Because he says there is for God, because God's unique.